Hi, folks. This is Don Meisner with the North Country Fishing Report. I want to talk about blade baits. We've talked about them before, but I'll bet you most of you never use them. And I think when I've gone into Walmart and looked at their lure selection, that's one type of bait that you don't see as often in some of even the bigger supplied stores. But blade baits are essentially blades of steel that are shaped like a fish, and they tend to be heavier. There's no lip on them or anything else. They flash or they're painted colors, but they're the perfect type of baits for vertical jigging because they sink down quickly. You can really feel what they're doing down there in the water. And they have 3 different holes. Most of them have 3 different holes on top that you can determine how the blade actually works in the water by which hole you tie your line into. But let's talk a little bit about these blade baits. Number one, when the water starts getting colder in the fall, when there's sudden changes in water temperature, lots and lots of bait fish are very vulnerable to this, and this is when they start dying. And this is when schools of other fish, they know this instinctively, and they're looking for these dying bait fish. Well, when a bait fish is dying, they tend to flutter. They tend to move in a certain way that's an indicator that they are dying. And a blade bait, if you use it and jig it in the right manner, it more closely resembles a dying bait fish than any other type of lure that you can use. And so it's a fabulous lure to use before the ice comes in. Now, again, that'll be for next year because we already have the ice. But also, it's a perfect bait to use when you're jigging. Now, a lot of people want to use live bait, and that's a whole nother thing. But if you're using artificial baits, and there's so many people, that's what they do now, you let that bait go down towards the bottom, and you can either just flutter the rod tip that you're using, and that'll make it move around in the water, or you can jig it up and down. You can learn to do different things with that, and the fish will tell you. They're going to tell you whether it works or not, because you're going to know whether you get a strike or not. If you're doing it right, and you get a strike, if you're doing it right, you'll get a strike. And if you get a strike doing one thing, then keep doing that same thing until the fish stop biting. And then you'll know to experiment and do something else. There's all kinds of different blade baits. I talked to Jigger Jim about this, and he said way back before all the sonars and the new screens and Vexilars and so forth made it possible for us to watch the fish and what they do. When he would fish Oneida Lake, he would use a head and sonar, one of the first blade baits made. He was using a 5-foot rod. He'd let it go all the way to the bottom and then start violently jerking it up and down. And this is how he would jig for walleyes in Oneida Lake before some of these more modern techniques and lures were made, still using a blade bait. And it's interesting to know that. I asked Jim, I said, listen, does the type of rod and reel you use make a big difference? And he says, of course it does. Back then, I was using a 5-foot rod back in Oneida Lake, but now with more modern ice fishing techniques, you're using smaller rods. It enables you to jig it better, and especially if you're in a little hut, you want to have a short rod. And I asked him, I said, okay, let me ask you, does the action of the rod matter? He says, absolutely. He says, I like it with a fast tip. In other words, your tip is going to bend with the weight of with the weight of the lure. It's also going to move either up or down if you get a strike. And he says, once the lure gets down in the water, and the weight of the lure, because these are metal lures, and they're fairly significantly heavy, I guess, compared to some of the plastics. So the rod tip will be bent a little bit as it's sitting down there in the water. He says if you get a strike, it's not going to bend more. It's actually going to spring upright because the fish are coming from the bottom up. They're always striking upward. And so you'll watch your rod tip go straight, and that means you've got a strike if you're not seeing or feeling anything else. So there's lots of things that we can learn, that we can talk about, and hopefully it'll make it easier for you, especially if you haven't ice fished a lot, to go out this year and enjoy this sport. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meisner with the North Country Fishing Report.